Injustice anywhere, said Dr. King, is a threat to justice everywhere. With that in mind, we today discuss Honduras, the life and death of an environmental activist, and how both link back home. Ahead on Wide Angle. As the Trump administration clamors to seal off our borders to some, citing threats to wages, jobs, and safety, there is a notable silence and a stunning lack of curiosity, if not concern, as to why so many take the desperate step of entering the U.S. illegally in the first place. Case in point is the Central American country of Honduras. A tropical paradise under other circumstances, the small nation wedged between Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua is burdened with the highest per capita murder rate in the world, and amongst the highest rates of corruption, femicide, journalist killings, and repression. Why has this come to be? What role has our government played, and what lessons might we take away from that hardship and loss? Joining me from Toronto to discuss Honduras and our relationship with it is Canadian lawyer and activist Grahame Russell. Since 1995, Grahame has been the director of Rights Action, a nonprofit that raises funds for and awareness of community-controlled development, environmental, and human rights projects in Guatemala and Honduras. Welcome to Wide Angle, Grahame.
Thanks for having me on your program.
A pleasure. Let's start, if we can, with the circumstances in Honduras that provide sort of the backstory to our conversation today. Yeah, the year 2009 is key. In that year, a military coup removes sitting President Manuel Zelaya and sets in motion a project that effectively pits government and corporate forces against indigenous Hondurans. Admittedly, very broad strokes that I've just provided. If you could provide a little detail and a little bit of context to that history.
That is a very good summary. I think when it comes right down to it, the reason that the military, economic, and political elites in Honduras took the decision to carry out a military coup, an illegal, violent military coup in the first place, was because of their vested economic interests that are directly aligned with a whole series of global corporations and investors.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the bottom line,
mm-hmm.
but that's also the longer term context,
mm-hmm.
Led almost invariably by the United States and economic interests in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Honduras, like Central America, has experienced generations of interventions, direct military interventions, indirect military interventions, coup plots going back at least 100 years,
mm-hmm.
usually orchestrated to one degree or another by the United States in concert with political economic elites in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador, Nicaragua,
mm-hmm.
and with the goal of keeping in place or putting back in place a certain very unjust economic social order.
Right.
And so the coup in 2009 that was fully backed by the United States, and it must be said by Canada as well, was simply to do that, to rein in Mel Zelaya and some of the small changes his government was starting to implement and put back in power basically pro-corporate, pro-global investor elites.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a nightmare of violence and repression and corruption ever since then.
Right. I gather there is a particular project in the Agua Zarca Dam project, yeah? A corporation called DESA, which I think is, what is it? Desarrollos Energéticos, S.A., yeah? How does that play into this milieu that was developing after the coup?
To be fair, the roots of Honduras' exploitation and inequality go back before the 2009 military coup. In 2009 and leading up to 2009, Honduras had weak democratic structures, a weak but sort of growing stronger rule of law, administration of justice. And as I said, the government of President Zelaya were starting to bring about some small but significant sort of economic reforms to improve the well-being of the general population that live in conditions of historic and endemic poverty. The coup basically threw all that out the door, and it's, as I said earlier, it's been the most, and as you pointed out at the outset, it's been the most violent, repressive country in the Americas since the coup. But the underlying goal was to promote and benefit the wealthy economic elites, both Hondurans and their international partners. So the Agua Zarca hydroelectric dam project in western Honduras is just one of those economic projects that is a direct beneficiary of the coup. We could go on and talk at length about the role that Canadian mining companies are playing and how they're trying to increase their mineral investments and explorations in Honduras since the coup. We could look closely at the role that North Canadian and U.S. Tourism operators are, how they've been increasing their tourist interests on the north coast of Honduras, leading to widespread forced evictions of indigenous Garifuna people. The most violent region in the country is in the northern region of the Iguan Valley, the Iguan River Valley, where there's been a huge spike in the production of African palm for export to international markets, leading directly to the killings of close to 150 campesinos, because the large landowners, in concert with the World Bank, etc., are forcibly evicting campesinos from their lands to then increase production of African palm. So the Agua Zarca hydroelectric dam is just one of these large-scale investment projects in the name of development that is being implemented by sectors of the corrupt government in power in concert with international investors.
Right. And I guess maybe that is a project that I've heard of because of its connection with the work of Berta Kasitus. Yes. Yeah. So circumstances, and I'll fast forward a little bit after the coup. Circumstances come to a bit of a head last March the 2nd, when your dear friend and colleague Berta Kasitus was killed. Obviously, she was a very potent, a much celebrated environmentalist, known certainly in Honduras and around the world. She was a mother of four. She was an indigenous community activist. She was one of the leaders of Honduras's environmental movement. I assume that those who are responsible for her death felt that by cutting off the head of the movement, that the body would not be able to continue. Is that a fair assessment, do you think? And then the follow-up to that would be, how does the movement continue today after her loss?
I think, yes, to the first part of your question, it is a fair assessment. Yes, Berta was a very dear friend of myself and many other people.
Sure.
She was admired and respected throughout Honduras and throughout Central America, and increasingly over the last 5 to 10 years internationally. Yeah. She was traveling the world regularly, and she had a particularly powerful vision of a particularly powerful way of articulating the complexities of the issues that her people in Honduras were trying to deal with. And it was a very local to global vision at the same time. It should be noted that since the coup in 2009, as many as 500 people have been killed for political reasons in Honduras. Just in the Iguan region alone that I mentioned earlier, 150 plus campesinos have been killed for targeted assassinations or killed during protests and forced evictions. And across the country, it's estimated between 400 and 500. So in one sense, Berta's killing, political killing, assassination, was just the most recent of hundreds. Right. And that's very important to highlight that point, because it wasn't just a one-off case. It wasn't just one sort of incident in an otherwise well-functioning society. Assassinating and going after human rights leaders, indigenous leaders, environmental leaders, is how Honduras operates as a society now,
Right.
particularly since the coup in 2009. And then to get to your question, that the Honduran regime, which is still, I think, is a very corrupted regime, it's an anti-democratic regime, it's a military-backed regime, it's simply supported by Canada and the United States and the World Bank for all the wrong reasons, that it could take a decision to kill someone, to target and kill someone as prominent as Berta, is ominous. They're not just trying to get rid of one particular leader, which they did, but they're trying to send a message to all Hondurans, let alone a message to other Central American leaders, community leaders who are involved in similar struggles. We can do this to you. And look, a year later, the United States, Canada, the World Bank, they have not cut off any of their economic relations with us. They have not cut off any of their political relations with us. They have not cut off any of their military relations with us. We have that amount of impunity.
To make it perhaps a little bit more bleak yet, there was the suggestion, yes, and it may be stronger than a suggestion, I'll put that to you, that the Honduran military employed both the U.S. Marine Corps and the Federal Bureau of Investigations from the United States to train the Honduran special forces that were implicated in Berta's assassination. To your knowledge, what role did the U.S. government play in the lead up to that specific event?
Anyone who works on human rights issues, issues of fighting for democracy, trying to promote democracy, defend human rights, promote transparency, try and rebuild the rule of law in a country like Guatemala, let alone El Salvador, or in a country like Honduras, let alone Honduras, let alone Guatemala or El Salvador, will always tell you that all power in the country begins and ends with the embassy, la embajada. And that they're referring to the U.S. Embassy. They don't even say it in their discussion.
Right.
So when you talk about power in Honduras, and that means military power, economic power, and political power, la embajada, the embassy, the U.S. Embassy is at the heart and center of all power machinations in Honduras. That story goes back 100 years. That's a bit of a simplification and a generalization, but it goes to answering your question. The United States, politically, economically, militarily, or security-wise, has everything to do with the Honduran military, the Honduran police, the impunity with which they act, and the repression that they carry out. That's just a general way how things operate. That does not mean that a decision was taken in the United States in some office to assassinate Berta on that day. It just means that the backdrop to all military and police operations in general in Honduras is with the United States because of the historical relationship and the ongoing relationship. In the short term, to answer more specifically your question, since the coup, the United States has simply not cut off any military aid whatsoever. Secondly, they are directly funding and supporting a particular military unit in the northern region called the Satruch Military Command that is directly and indirectly responsible for some of the killings of the 150 people in the Iguan region that I spoke about. And it's now been documented that some of the material authors of the killing of Berta Kasitus had their military links to the Satruch military command in the northern region of Honduras, and they received some of their military training in the past in U.S.-run military training schools in the United States. None of that is surprising. That's just how the Honduran military operates. With respect to the FBI, it is known that the FBI is now directly involved in supporting, quote unquote, supporting the investigation into Berta's killing. That's like letting the fox into the hen house, according to many people in Honduras. It's a corrupted legal system to begin with, so there's little faith that the Honduran legal system will properly and fully investigate who are the material and intellectual authors of her assassination. But B, that the United States FBI experts are directly participating with them just sends up more red flags for many people who would be hoping that perhaps real justice might be done in this case.
Right. Let's take a quick break there if we can, Grahame, and invite viewers to join us after this break as Grahame and I bring the lessons of Honduras home. We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. And if you'd like to hear more about this or other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle. Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermudez, speaking today with Grahame Russell of Rights Action about Honduras. All right, so we spent and focused the first half, Grahame, on sort of laying some historical understanding, some backdrop for viewers to hopefully get some sense of what might be a newer situation. And let's leap forward to where we are today and where we're headed. Yeah, in the United States here, which I'm sure you're well aware of, we have a new administration. We have a new Secretary of Homeland Security. General John Kelly is his name. He is somebody who, for the past 4 years, had worked on the Southern Command, which is essentially the military operations for the United States in South and Central America. Over the course of that time, I gather, he got to know quite well the current president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and it leads me to wonder. Certainly there is some sense of relationship between the two countries. You've stated that quite clearly. A relationship between current leaders as well. And I'm wondering if you have a sense as to what the Trump administration's entree onto the political scene might bring for the relationship with Honduras, specifically the South and Central America, maybe more generally.
More of the same.
Yeah.
That would be my general comment. The specifics will play themselves out from country to country, and there may be some twists and turns that will simply surprise me, for example.
Yeah.
But with my reading of U.S. history in Central America, let alone Latin America, and with my reading of Central American politics, past and current, it'll be more of the same. More of the same politically, militarily, and economically. Perhaps there'll be a worsening of it. With the forced removal of 2.5 million Central Americans and Mexicans under the previous administration, and with this U.S. government clearly showing that it's going to continue deporting Central Americans and Mexicans, that's at least more of the same. And if they ramp it up, it'll be more of the same and ramped up.
Right.
And all of that, in my view, will go to just sadly recreating the very conditions in countries like Honduras and Guatemala that forced people to flee north in the first place.
Right. Which is a part of the story that we frequently don't hear here. Yeah.
It's a story we always don't hear here.
Yeah.
For the most part, in what many loosely refer to as the mainstream media. It's the elephant in the room of the debate and discussion around the 10 or 11 million undocumented people living in the United States.
All right, I'm not going to suggest, I know, that there is a silver lining to this, Grahame. However, there is a bill in our U.S. Congress, House Resolution 5474, also called the Berta Kasitus Human Rights Act in Honduras. It was last summer, as I gather, introduced to the U.S. Congress. It's a bill that has 51 co-sponsors, if I'm current, and 4 of whom are from our own state of Massachusetts here. Can you tell us a bit about the bill and its status?
The fact that legislation has gotten so many supporters in the U.S. is absolutely a positive sign. It shows a very solid level of consciousness is rising to some of the highest levels in the U.S. power structures.
Yeah. And if I can interject, Grahame, What does the bill seek to do? Yeah.
Condition, once again, to condition any U.S. military assistance, military / security assistance to Honduras on a series of conditions, including the full and proper resolution of the criminal investigation into the killing of Berta.
Okay.
And so, A, I don't think it's going to pass, unfortunately, and become binding law. And B, if it did, I think in the short term, it wouldn't be that effective because of the nature of so many multiple military, security, and police relations between the U.S. government and Honduras. I still think it's an extraordinarily positive effort to bring real change at the highest levels in the U.S. government, because it shows a level of awareness at the highest levels of politicians in the U.S. government.
I'd like to too shift a little bit. We had our conversation at break about some similarities between the indigenous movement in Honduras, about similar instances in the United States, and I think most recently the one that we can pick out and focus on is Standing Rock. Certainly the measures are not the same. What governments and corporations feel able to do in Honduras is very different than what similar structures feel capable of doing here. However, some of the measures are similar, and certainly watching people at Standing Rock being hit with water cannons in sub-zero weather, because the Hondurans have gone through and continued to go through, regrettably, such repressive treatment. Are there conceivably lessons that they would have to share with us?
Well, I'll take your question about the lessons and just shift it a bit to how I understand what are the underlying takeaways from all this.
Okay.
For me, the underlying, and I fully agree with your question that tries to compare these two situations. Just taking that one alone. Berta Kasitus struggling with the indigenous Lenca people against one hydroelectric dam project characterized by corruption, illegality, lack of need, lack of consultation, and comparing that with the Standing Rock situation, which has many of the same characteristics. I think there is more in common with with the underlying issues than there are differences, and that's going to become increasingly true going towards the future. That, for me, is the major takeaway. In the short term, it is correct to say that the country of Honduras is characterized by higher degrees of endemic poverty and exploitation, higher degrees of corruption and impunity in the very institutions of the state and society, whether it's the executive branch, the judiciary, the military, the police. There are some very clear differences in the short term, but the underlying issues are really quite similar. And the motivational forces that are imposing these quote-unquote economic development projects are very similar. The economic interests behind all of the oil and gas pipelines being imposed across Canada and the U.S. are similar, if not identical, to the economic interests of the violent imposition of hydroelectric dams or mining projects or African palm production in Honduras. And that, for me, is the most important takeaway. That increasingly we're understanding that these are not Honduran issues over there and American issues over here or Canadian issues here up north. These are human issues. And what is the what is the economic, social, political model that we all want to live under as we increasingly live together as one people on this planet?
Right. All right. So let's say, Grahame, and I trust this is the case, that there are viewers who are, as a result of hearing this conversation, interested in finding out more. Yeah? A sense of resources, be they organizations, websites, that people can turn to find out more and perhaps become engaged in this issue.
In the short term, I mean, it's quite easy to to get on something like Rights Action's listserv.
Okay.
And you would get, and then through Rights Action, you can get in touch with organizations like the Honduras Solidarity Network.
Mm-hmm.
You can get in touch with organizations like that of our friend Bev Bell and Other Worlds.
Right.
Rights Action circulates regular information from a wide range of organizations working on these types of issues from this perspective, related more directly to Honduras and Guatemala.
Mm-hmm.
So I invite people to go to rightsaction.org,
Okay.
learn more about our work, click the links, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, the listserv, etc.
Okay.
But for me, the more important takeaway is the broader issues.
Mm-hmm.
And just taking one issue that you and I talked about, I think it's hugely important that we have a much more critical debate in the US about what are the underlying causes forcing so many thousands of people, decade after decade,
Mm-hmm.
generation after generation, to flee countries like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico,
Right.
and flee into the US. And what are the US and Canadian policy decisions, economic, military policy decisions that contribute to and create those very conditions of repression, poverty, and violence that force so many people to flee north, generation after generation.
I can't thank you enough, both for spending time with me today, as well as for your, let's say, 25 years of service and going back and forth between Canada and Central America, and your experience and ability to articulate that message for people like us who maybe don't make the trip but are concerned about the issues nonetheless.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program.
Absolutely. Separated by some 2,000 miles and figurative walls of a cultural sort, it would be easy for us to pay little attention to an insignificant place like Honduras. Except, of course, that it's not insignificant, nor are the lives that are lived there. As we Arlingtonians consider the wisdom of becoming a sanctuary town, like so many other localities across the country today, we would do well to remember Honduras, Berta Kasitus, and the multitude of nameless others, some of whom remain in the countries of their birth to do the work that needs doing, as well as those who feel compelled to move on and perhaps help us do ours. For Grahame Russell, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.